Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello. Welcome back. I hope you've had a great week. I've had a wonderful week. A busy week, but wonderful. This week I was able to walk across the stage and received my master's degree in criminology. I actually finished and defended my thesis in December, but the actual ceremony was this week, and it actually made it feel a little more official. It was a long time dream of mine, and I was able to accomplish it this week. And I have to say, I'm a little proud of myself. Marv and Marge update for this week. I'm not sure what morning it was, but one morning I was standing at the sink in the kitchen and I looked out the back window, which looks directly into the back room of my house, and I saw fucking Marv hanging by his tail from a beam in the back room. This motherfucker is swinging from a beam like a fucking monkey. And I swear to you, he was looking straight at me the entire time with a bloody smirk on his face. Number one, fuck you, Marv. And number two, I never knew that squirrels had prehensile tails. You know, the kind of tails that like monkeys have where they can swing from them and pick things up with them. Like, I never knew squirrels had that. Did you? I have to say that as much as I would love to see nothing better than Marv dying a slow, agonizing death for all the times that son of a bitch has mocked me, I have learned quite a bit about squirrels. But we still have to do something about Marv and Marge, because we can't all live in the same house. But it's not going to be me. Squirrels are fucking crazy. They'll kill you, man. If you enjoy any of these episodes that I put out weekly, please head over to the Patreon page and show us some support. For just a few dollars a month, you can get exclusive access to the Bitter Bits, shorter episodes where I just talk about whatever I want, basically. I haven't put one out in a while, and I am working on one right now, and I'm hoping to get that out possibly next week. So for those of you who do support me, there's another one coming. You can also subscribe here on Spotify. You can also email me at thebitterwitness@gmail.com if you have any ideas for shows, or if you just want to tell me what you think of the show. I would love to hear from you. With that, the dogs are sleeping behind me. Puppy ASMR is brought to you by both Miley and Piper this week. So grab a cup of tea, sit back, and relax while I tell you about the case of Cally Jo Larson. Trigger warning for this episode. This episode includes child murder. As always, I want to give the victims in the case top billing. Cally Jo, I acknowledge you, and I send my love to you wherever you may be. This week, our case takes us to the town of Waseca, Minnesota. In 2022, Waseca had a population of 9,000. It's a very small little town. Everybody knows everybody. You've all lived in one of these or known of one of these little towns. It was a quiet, peaceful little town, and unfortunately, evil reared its ugly head there in 1999. Near the town of Waseca, Minnesota, Connie Larson lived on the edge of Loon Lake with her 3 daughters. Loon Lake is about a 3-minute drive outside of Waseca. Connie stated in an interview that her 3 girls were close. They were always together. 12-year-old Cally Jo, the youngest, loved gymnastics, and she just excelled at it. Connie said she was the baby of the family, daddy's little girl, and she just exuded energy. On April 20th, 1999, Cally Jo left Waseca Junior High School, got on her school bus, and went home. In order for Cally Jo to get to her house after getting off the bus, she had to walk down a wooded path. Now, when I say wooded, I don't mean covered or dark. The path simply has woods on either side, but it's a wide path. It doesn't appear from the photos to be a path that would make me feel uncomfortable walking down it at all. That day, Cally Jo was the first one home. She unlocked the front door and entered her house. Connie stated that the family rule was that everyone needed to be home by 5 p.m. and there were to be no visitors because Connie arrived home at 5 o'clock and that was when the family would spend their time together. Cally Jo's sister, 16-year-old Jamie, was the next one to arrive home that day. She opened the front door to a nightmare that would haunt her for the rest of her life. When she opened the door, her home looked like a tornado had hit it. It was obvious that they had been robbed. Everything was thrown about the house. She saw Cally Jo's backpack just inside the front door on the floor. Then she saw the orange extension cord on the stairs leading up to the upstairs bedrooms. In the hallway, she saw Cally Jo hanging by her neck. Cally Jo had been stabbed, according to the investigators, and the fatal stab wound had been to Cally Jo's left chest area. That stab wound had cut her ascending aorta, and 12-year-old Cally Jo had internally bled to death. Jamie hysterically called her mother at work and then dialed 911. Cally Jo's murder was the first murder in history in Waseca. Needless to say, there was a general terror that swept through this small Minnesota town. No one felt safe anymore. It may be a cliche, but the townspeople began to lock their doors, which they had never felt the need to do before Cally Jo was killed. The police found that the point of entry for the killer was the basement door. The basement door in the crime scene photos looks like one of those old doors made up of a bunch of thin pieces of wood put together, something like you would see on an old farmhouse. The closing latch of the door looked like one of those old latches from the 1800s where you would have to lift a lever, which would in turn lift the hook and open the door. Connie stated that there was only some cash, silver certificates, and the 3 girls' CD collection stolen from the home. Police found drops of blood on the stairs heading up to the bedrooms. It was collected for testing. They also tested as many surfaces as they could, looking for fingerprints. They vacuumed the floor to try and collect any evidence that the killer may have left behind. Law enforcement ended up with hundreds of fingerprints found in the home, as well as just about as many hairs picked up by the vacuuming of the floors. Essentially, a Mount Everest of evidence for the forensic scientists to sift through and test. The testing showed that the blood drops they had found on the stairs belonged to Cally Jo. When the scientists finally made it through the mountain of prints that they had, they were able to identify every single print to either a family member or a friend of the family. There was one print that the police had found in the bathroom on the sink that they were having difficulty figuring out whose it was, but scientists would later determine that it belonged to Cally Jo. The only other forensic evidence that the investigators had were 2 hairs with no root material that were found inside the home. One of the hairs was found on the carpet, and the other was found on Cally Jo's body. But without root material on these 2 hairs, there could be no conclusive DNA testing. Essentially, the police had nothing to go on at this point. Fingerprint expert Dave Peterson was able to identify Cally Jo's fingerprints just by looking at them after examining all the fingerprints that were in the house. And there was a reason for this. Cally Jo had quite the unique pattern for her fingerprint. She had a loop pattern, but there was a second loop over the first loop, and the second loop came to a point at one end. A double loop pattern such as Cally Jo's only appears in about 5 to 7% of the population. With fingerprints, there are three specific types that have been identified: loop, arch, and whorl. Now, I'm going to give you a quick lesson on fingerprints. When you hear police talking about latent fingerprints, they're actually talking about a fingerprint that doesn't show up right away without some kind of intervention, such as fingerprint powder or a chemical reaction that will adhere to the oils left by the finger, which allows the fingerprint to be seen. Every fingerprint is unique to an individual, and fingerprints do not change during a lifetime unless there is some kind of damage to the dermal skin. For example, John Dillinger, the absolute infamous gangster, used acid on his fingertips to try and alter his fingerprints. Now, as I said, there are the three different types of basic fingerprint patterns: arch, loop, and whorl. When we look at the three different types of fingerprints, an arch looks like a mountain, sort of. It's a curved line that just repeats itself all through the fingerprint. When we look at a loop, it looks more like an open-ended oval, and the lines follow that pattern outward. A whorl is a circular pattern. So Cally Jo's fingerprints had double loop. So there was one loop and then on top of that another loop, which, as I said earlier, is extremely rare. As I said, latent prints are a type of print that requires processing. So it needs the fingerprint powder or a chemical reaction of some type. But there's also two other types of prints that can be picked up. A patent print is a print that is absolutely visible and doesn't need any processing of any type. So, for example, it could be a fingerprint in blood or dirt or something like that left at the scene. And then we have a plastic print, which is a fingerprint which you can see, but it's in a soft surface like silly putty or butter or maybe tar, something like that. These prints are actually three-dimensional and they don't really require further processing, but there's a different process for lifting or retrieving the print to be used as evidence. So now that that little lesson on fingerprints is complete, we are going to carry on with our case. The police were able to locate a witness. It was a neighbor who stated that they had seen a man around Cally Jo's house around the time of the murder, but they didn't know him. He was out of place. A police sketch artist was able to produce a sketch of this man. The sketch is that of a man who I would place most likely in the age range of 25 to 40-ish. He has a thick mustache and dark hair and dark eyes. And when you look at the sketch, it's a front-on view of the man's face. And if you look at the ears, they almost look like they come to a little point at the top. It's very odd and very creepy when you stare at this picture for quite a long time. Another neighbor saw a black pickup truck in the area that they didn't recognize. Now, I need to stop and say something about neighbors who actually look around and notice things that don't belong or that aren't normally in their neighborhood. Don't hate on them, because when the shit hits the fan, they're going to be the ones who hold the info to catch your killer or your robber or whatever criminal the police are looking for. I'm always watching out my window and checking out the street. Yes, it's annoying, but when the chips are down, I've got the 411 on what's going on in my little corner of the world. Of course, this all could just be because I'm too obsessed with true crime and murder, but someday it will pay off. So you know what's going to happen next, right? The old dirtbag roundup, my friends. They had a general sketch of someone who didn't belong, so the police started looking at those men in the area who resembled the creepy guy in the sketch, and also had a past criminal record with things like burglary, break and enter, or a sexual predator of some type. They came up with a pool of potential suspects who might fit the bill. Out of that pool of possible suspects, They had 12 men that they couldn't exclude from being the man that the neighbor saw that day near the home of Cally Jo. The police began calling these 12 the Dirty Dozen. This is quite unsettling. I know in the States you can see where sex offenders are living in your area. However, here in Canada, there is nothing like that available for people to look at. I've looked at some of the maps that the States produces showing where these perverts are located, and it reminds me of the saying, you're always within a foot of a spider no matter where you go. Well, it's almost like that on these maps. Watch your children, watch your family members, and don't take unnecessary risks. In Canada, law enforcement will sometimes announce if a sexual predator is about to move into a neighborhood, but only if there's a high chance of that sexual offender re-offending. And the photo of the dirtbag moving into the neighborhood is not normally published publicly. They will notify the area, the neighborhood, that this person is going to be living there. And if you want to see what that person looks like, you have to go down to the police station. And they'll show you the picture of the sexual predator for a couple of seconds. I went to a website for the States, and I picked a random address in Mobile, Alabama. And I plugged it into this search page using a 3-mile radius from that address. And 88 sex offenders came up living within that radius. And if I clicked on one of the red dots that appeared on the map, I could see the sex offender's picture, and with a simple search, I could find the shitbag's address, zip code, sex, age, eye color, hair color, height, weight, marks, scars, tattoos, race, any aliases that they've used, and all their crimes and the dates of the conviction of every single sex offender. The part that I don't agree with about that kind of information being available that easily to the general public is the addresses of where they're living. We just don't need any vigilante shit happening in this world. More crime doesn't make crime stop. But I have to say, Canada, we need to do better to protect our children and our family members. That was a little bit of a tangent rant. Moving on. One of the 12 of the Dirty Dozen was a convicted sex offender named Donald Bloom. Law enforcement focused in on Bloom because he was also the suspect in a kidnapping and murder of a 19-year-old girl, Katie Poyer, who had been working at a convenience store in Moose Lake, Minnesota. Now, Moose Lake was about 2.5 hours north of Waseca. In Katie's case, law enforcement had video of Katie being taken out of the convenience store with a man with his hands on the back of her neck. But the fucking video wasn't clear enough to positively identify the shit snake who took and murdered her. I've seen the video stills from Katie's abduction, and it broke my heart. You can see clearly this asshole taking her, and you can see Katie going out the door, and you just know from her body language and her face that she is absolutely terrified. This poor baby. Oh, my heart. Why the fuck are all these videos so fucking shitty? I can go on YouTube right now and watch a crystal clear video of what the astronauts are doing up in space, or I can look up pictures from Mars, but I can't clearly see this douche fuck's face. I think that employees should ask to see the quality of video that their place of employment has. And if it is shit, get out of there. Essentially, that means that your boss doesn't give enough fucks about you to actually shell out the money for a decent camera. And it's not like they're that expensive now. I mean, look at the quality of Ring and doorbell cameras. I saw the Ring doorbell footage of Anne Hesh speeding past a house before she was sadly killed in that accident, and it was clear as a bell. I could see Anne Hesh's face, and she was out on the street. Do better, people. Care about each other. I'm going to try and make that my last rant for this episode. Another reason that law enforcement focused on Bloom was because he had made several trips to Waseca around the time of Cally Jo's murder, and he drove a black pickup truck. Of course, Bloom denied having anything to do with Cally Jo's murder. He said he had an alibi. Literally, law enforcement had nothing to hold Bloom on or to arrest anyone else for that matter. And it started to discourage the police, and they were beginning to think that Cally Jo's murder might become a cold case. A few months after Cally Jo's murder, a rash of home burglaries in Waseca started occurring, and the majority of them were pretty close to Cally Jo's home. At one of the crime scenes, police found a shoe impression in the snow, and the shoe impression was from a set of sneakers or running shoes, and it had a distinctive zigzag pattern on the sole. Police officer Chris Markison stated that a lot of the burglaries had been happening on his shift, and it was starting to become personal to him. So he started getting more hyper aware while on patrol. One night, while on patrol, Markison spotted a man walking down the sidewalk. When he drove past the man immediately changed direction and started walking the opposite way. Markison stated in an interview that the hairs on the back of his neck rolled up, and he knew in his gut he needed to talk to this guy. Markison turned around and stopped the man to ask him a few questions. While he was talking to the man, Markison looked down and saw that the man had left a shoe print in the snow, and Markison said his blood ran cold. The shoe pattern in the snow was the same zigzag pattern that had been left at some of the crime scenes of the burglaries. Markison put the man up against the car and began to pat him down. While doing this, he found a couple of screwdrivers and a flashlight in the man's pocket. Burglary tools, as the police identified later. I get it. There had been burglaries in the area, and the police have just stopped a man walking at night with the same shoe pattern that was found at some of the crime scenes, and he just happens to have these things in his pocket. And not all people would carry these things in their pocket, but some would, and not for nefarious reasons. So to call them burglary tools, I would say, is a little bit of a stretch. I mean, at the very least, it's a stretch. I mean, technically, anything could be called a burglary tool if it's used in the correct way. I'm not a big fan of this charge, as you can tell. To me, it's just a superfluous tool for the police to use to hold someone. And if I were representing someone inside a courtroom, I would argue it was a very weak charge. I mean, he could have been going over to help out a buddy with something or whatever. And the stop occurred at 8 p.m., so not late at night. On the flip side of that, I would say, however, that finding these items on someone walking alone at night and that person having the same shoe pattern that was left at the crime scenes would warrant further investigation into the person. Wouldn't you? I would have done what Markison did. I lied. That wasn't my last rant for this episode, but I'm going to really try hard now not to do any side rants. I promise. The man was identified as Lorenzo Sanchez, born November 10th, 1972. He was working illegally in the U.S., and he was originally from Mexico. He was living in a trailer just outside of Waseca, very close to Cally Jo Larson's house. When the police searched his home, they found property that had been reported stolen from many of the burglaries that had been taking place in Waseca. Police began to wonder if Sanchez might possibly be the man who was seen in the neighborhood the day that Cally Jo was murdered. I've seen the side-by-sides of the sketch and of Lorenzo Sanchez, and there is a resemblance. Sanchez has the mustache and the dark hair and the dark eyes. I would give the similarity of the sketch and Sanchez a 7 out of 10, maybe a 6.5 out of 10. So similar-ish. The police arrested Sanchez for the burglaries, and once he was in jail, the burglaries stopped. Got him! Law enforcement continued to search Sanchez's home. They kept finding more and more items that had been stolen during the rash of burglaries. and then they stumbled across a cache of CDs. They immediately thought that these might be the collection of CDs that had been stolen from Cally Jo's house the day of her murder. But upon further investigation, it was determined that they actually were not the CDs from Cally Jo's house. But the police also found empty CD holders in a closet inside Sanchez's home. For those of you who remember using CDs, they were those vinyl cases that zipped up and had the empty white flaps inside to hold the CDs. If you don't remember them, let me tell you, we all had them, and we all had lots of them. Law enforcement thought maybe the CDs from Cally Jo's house were inside these CD cases at one point. So the police photographed the cases and took the picture to Connie, Cally Jo's mom. Connie looked at the picture and said, "Yes, those are Cally Jo's." Of course, Sanchez denied that the cases were stolen and told the police that the cases were his. He said he bought those in a store. At the point that Sanchez was arrested, it had almost been a year since Cally Jo had been murdered. The police sent the CD cases to the forensic scientists to see if by any chance there was any evidence of any kind on the cases. But when the scientists got the cases, there was a problem. The cases were made of vinyl, and getting fingerprints off of vinyl is almost next to impossible. And even if you were able to get a print, the chances of getting one that could be used to identify someone is even harder. Lifting fingerprints off of non-porous surfaces such as vinyl is extremely difficult because the fingerprints that are left on vinyl are ridiculously fragile. And the sooner the prints are preserved, the better. It had almost been a year since Cally Jo had been murdered, and they didn't know how long those CD cases were actually inside that closet. And so the chances of finding anything usable on those cases was almost zero. Police sent the cases to fingerprint expert Dave Peterson, who we talked about earlier. Dave began examining the cases, and in between two of the flaps on one of the cases, he found a blonde hair. Then he used a technique using super glue to try and find any fingerprints on the inside flaps of the cases. He hung the two cases from a pole and fanned out the sleeves that are inside the cases. Then he places some super glue inside an aluminum pan. All of this is placed inside a chamber. And then he lights the heat source. And what happens is, as the super glue is heated, fumes will start to fill the chamber, and the chemicals in the fumes will adhere to the moisture left behind on the surfaces in the fingerprints, and it will turn the ridge detail in fingerprints white. When he was finished doing this process, he found one print on the very last flap of one of the cases. And that print had a very distinctive overlapping double loop pattern. Peterson said he knew immediately that it was Cally Jo's fingerprint. But, as a good scientist, he continued with the analysis and concluded that the print he found was Cally Jo's print. Fucking gotcha, bitch boy. Peterson called Special Agent Bob Berg at the Minnesota Bureau of Crime Apprehension, who had taken over the case of Cally Jo's murder, and informed him that he had found Cally Jo's fingerprint inside the CD case recovered from the home of Sanchez. In an interview, Berg stated that his reaction to the news from Peterson was, "You gotta be shitting me." The blonde hair that Peterson found inside the CD cases came back after testing belonging to Cally Jo. Of course, this piece of shit Sanchez denied he was involved in the murder of Cally Jo. And really, when you look at what evidence law enforcement had on him, they really only had proof that Sanchez was in possession of a piece of stolen property from the scene of a crime. They didn't have any evidence that actually linked him to the murder of Cally Jo. By the time all of this came around, it had been a year since Cally Jo was murdered. Sanchez could have picked those cases up at a yard sale or gotten them from a friend or even found them in the trash somewhere. But remember the 2 hairs that the police found at the murder scene that they couldn't figure out where they were from? Police sent those 2 hairs, along with a hair sample from Sanchez, to a lab for mitochondrial DNA testing. Mitochondria live outside the nucleus of a cell, and all members of a maternal lineage, that is, the mother's family line, have the same sequence in their mitochondrial DNA. So the samples, in this case the hairs, are turned into liquid, and the mitochondrial DNA is extracted, and then through a process, a sequence is produced. And that is the same sequence in every person who is blood related through the maternal line of that family. Once the sequence was produced, it was then compared with a sample of mitochondrial DNA from Sanchez. The results showed that the hairs found at the scene of Cally Jo's murder were from Sanchez's maternal line. But there's still a problem. Law enforcement only know that someone within the maternal lineage of Lorenzo Sanchez left those hairs at Cally Jo's murder scene. Now they had to figure out which person in that maternal line it was. And Lorenzo Sanchez had 6 brothers and sisters who all had the same mitochondrial DNA. When police started looking into Sanchez's family members, they found that 2 of Sanchez's brothers, Miguel and Pedro Sanchez, had been in Waseca, Minnesota at the time of Cally Jo's murder. Pedro Sanchez was older than Lorenzo and a half-brother, but they had the same mother, and so therefore the same mitochondrial DNA. Pedro stated that he was in Mexico on the day of Cally Jo's murder, and that he had an alibi there to prove where he was. Police checked out his alibi, and it checked out. So he wasn't the killer. Miguel stated that he was in Waseca the day of Cally Jo's murder, but he was at work at the same time of the murder. The police verified this, and so he wasn't the killer. That only left Lorenzo, who was in Waseca and had the same mitochondrial DNA that was found in the hairs at the crime scene. Lorenzo's work timesheet also showed that he was not at work when Cally Jo was killed, and he wasn't able to come up with an alibi. Gotcha for sure this time, shitfuck. So the police charged Lorenzo Sanchez with the first-degree murder of Cally Jo Larson. Of course, Sanchez maintained his innocence all along. But then, and this is always my favorite part of any case, I love me a dumb-ass criminal. While Sanchez was in prison, he received a visit from a sister-in-law. And during that visit, naturally, their conversation was taped. In the conversation, Sanchez says to his sister-in-law, "You know, the only thing they have to link me is the hair. You understand? The hair is the only thing they've got." Then he proceeds to ask his sister-in-law to place the blame for Cally Jo's killing on his half-brother Pedro. His sister-in-law refused. Now, I don't know if the sister-in-law that was at the jail was actually Pedro's wife, but thank the Lord she refused. Law enforcement stated that there was some kind of animosity between Pedro and Lorenzo, and Pedro had a criminal record with violent offenses, and so Lorenzo figured that the police would believe that Pedro had killed Cally Jo given his past crimes. Police confronted Lorenzo with the tape of the conversation, and Lorenzo had little choices left but to confess to the killing of Cally Jo. He pled guilty to the first-degree murder of 12-year-old Cally Jo and was convicted. According to Sanchez, Cally Jo had gotten home that day from school and walked in on him while he was robbing the Larson home. Sanchez said he killed little Cally Jo so that she wouldn't be able to identify him to the police for the robbery. He said he tied her up using an orange extension cord and then went to the kitchen and got a knife and stabbed Cally Jo. He then used the extension cord he had tied her up with to string her body from the upstairs banister. What a fucking piece of shit. During the sentencing phase, Sanchez asked Cally Jo's family to forgive him for taking away their baby girl. In her interview, Connie, Cally Jo's mom, stated after a long pause, "When you haven't been in this place, it's hard to know what you would do. But being in this place, it hasn't been hard for me. Honestly, on that day, I put it down." On March 9th, 2001, Sanchez was sentenced to life in prison. And that is the murder of Cally Jo Larson. My thoughts. This case was horrific. I can't imagine the horror that Cally Jo went through that day. And I can't even fathom the level of terror that that poor little baby went through. As well, the trauma that Jamie has suffered from finding her sister like that. I can't even imagine what I would do or how I would deal with someone taking one of my children away. That shitfuck Sanchez deserved the death penalty. I only wish that Minnesota had have had it at the time. He took away this little angel for what? Some fucking CDs and some silver certificates? And then he continued on with his life like nothing happened. Continued on breaking into homes and stealing. If he wasn't caught by happenstance the way he was, he probably would have run into the same scenario again and killed someone else. The viciousness of the killing of Cally Jo Larson leads me to believe that this was not the first time that Lorenzo Sanchez has killed someone. You just don't jump from burglary to that level of viciousness. There are steps in between. There's escalation periods. It's like when someone is a thief, they don't start out taking something huge. They usually start out by pocketing a chocolate bar or something small, and then they realize that they got away with it, so they do it again. And the need for the thrill of getting away with it keeps them increasing how much they steal or how much the value of something is that they steal. Their cockiness increases. I have to point out that this case was a case that not a lot of people heard about because Cally Jo was murdered on the exact same day that the Columbine shooting took place. And this leads into a whole other conversation regarding the media coverage that accompanied that horrible attack at Columbine High School. I won't get into that here because I promised I would tone down the side ramps, but I will say this. If the coverage of Columbine hadn't altered the norm of media coverage the way it did, I believe that Cally Jo's case might have been solved a little bit sooner than it was. While the world was trying to view as many things as they could about the shootings at Columbine, and the media was inundating the airwaves and print with information and pictures and videos about Columbine, all information about Cally Jo's murder was lost in the back pages of the press, and her killer was living and working in plain sight. I hope you enjoyed that case. That was absolutely awful. My heart goes out to the Larson family, and I hope that they've been able to somewhat bring their family back together. A tragedy like this always has a tendency of causing fractures, and my only hope is that if that did happen to the Larsons, it has been resolved. If you enjoyed this episode or any episode that we've done, please go to our Patreon page and show us some love. For a few dollars a month, you get exclusive access to the Bitter Bits. Also, if you're listening on Apple, please give me a 5-star review. It really helps the podcast. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful week. Enjoy your day today. This has been a Bitter Witness production.